Irish police fired tear gas and water cannons at thousands of fuel protesters surrounding the Whitegate oil refinery this morning, as global energy prices hit levels not seen since the 1973 oil crisis. What started as a peaceful demonstration over petrol costs exceeding €4 per litre has now escalated into Ireland's most serious civil unrest in decades, with major highways blocked and emergency fuel rationing introduced across the European Union. The roots of today's chaos trace back to February 28th, when Israeli F-35 fighter jets struck Iran's Karg Island terminal in the opening hours of what military analysts now call the Third Gulf War. That single coordinated strike eliminated 40% of Iran's oil export capacity overnight. Within 72 hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps retaliated by deploying naval mines across the Strait of Hormuz, effectively choking off 20% of global oil supplies. What makes this conflict unprecedented is not just its scale, but its timing. Unlike previous Middle Eastern wars that caught the world's energy infrastructure relatively prepared, this erupted during Europe's already precarious transition away from Russian energy following the Ukraine conflict. Iran's sophisticated anti-ship missile systems, including the Persian Gulf-deployed Khalij-Fars ballistic missiles, have successfully targeted at least 7 oil tankers attempting to navigate the strait. The Revolutionary Guard's asymmetric warfare doctrine, refined over decades of preparation for exactly this scenario, has proven devastatingly effective against conventional naval forces. Their use of fast attack craft swarms, coastal defense missiles, and underwater mining operations has essentially transformed the Strait of Hormuz into what Pentagon officials privately call an impenetrable kill zone. This morning's violence at Whitegate began when approximately 3,000 protesters, organized through encrypted messaging apps, simultaneously converged on Ireland's only oil refinery at dawn. Garda riot units deployed CS gas after demonstrators breached the facility's outer perimeter and began occupying critical infrastructure. The protesters, calling themselves the Fuel Justice Movement, are demanding immediate government intervention to cap energy prices and nationalize fuel distribution. Video footage shows massed protesters chaining themselves to refinery pipelines, while others blocked the N25 highway with burning tires. At least 47 people have been arrested, including 2 county councillors and a former member of parliament. The demonstrations spread rapidly to Cork, Dublin, and Galway, where similar scenes of civil disobedience unfolded throughout the day. Transport Minister Catherine Murphy announced emergency fuel rationing measures limiting private vehicles to 20 litres per week, while commercial transport faces a 30% reduction in diesel allocation. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea, British authorities are grappling with their own energy crisis as Brent crude futures touched $187 per barrel. The ripple effects extend far beyond fuel pumps, with Ireland's agricultural sector warning of imminent food shortages as transport costs make basic commodity distribution economically unviable. Simultaneously, reports from Pakistan indicate that high-level diplomatic talks between American and Iranian representatives have begun in Islamabad, mediated by Chinese foreign ministry officials, though both sides remain publicly committed to military objectives. The key players in this expanding crisis each face existential calculations that make de-escalation extraordinarily complex. President Trump's administration views Iranian capitulation as essential for maintaining American credibility in the Pacific, particularly as tensions with China intensify over Taiwan. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's government sees this as a historic opportunity to permanently degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and regional proxy network. Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei, facing the most serious threat to the Islamic Republic since its founding, has activated sleeper cells across the Middle East and authorized Hezbollah's full military engagement against Israeli positions. European leaders, led by German Chancellor Scholz and French President Macron, desperately seek a negotiated settlement as their economies teeter on recession's edge. Russia's Putin calculates that prolonged Middle Eastern instability serves Moscow's interests by diverting Western attention from Ukraine and potentially driving energy-desperate Europeans back toward Russian supplies. China's Xi Jinping walks the finest line, maintaining Iran as a crucial energy partner while avoiding sanctions that could devastate Chinese export markets. Each player's domestic political survival increasingly depends on outcomes thousands of miles away, creating a dangerous dynamic where compromise appears tantamount to political suicide. For India, this crisis represents both catastrophic vulnerability and unexpected opportunity. India imports 85% of its crude oil requirements, with Iran historically providing 12% of those supplies before sanctions. The closure of Hormuz forces Indian refiners to source expensive alternatives from Nigeria, Brazil, and North America, adding an estimated $15 billion annually to the import bill. Mumbai's stock exchange has lost 18% of its value since the conflict began, with transportation and manufacturing sectors hemorrhaging jobs. However, Delhi's strategic autonomy doctrine is finally paying dividends as India's carefully maintained relationships with all parties position it as an indispensable mediator. External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's shuttle diplomacy between Tehran, Washington, and Tel Aviv has elevated India's global stature while securing preferential access to alternative energy supplies. Indian refineries are rapidly expanding processing capacity for Venezuelan and Russian crude, potentially transforming the country into a major refined product exporter. The government's accelerated renewable energy investments, initially criticized as economically premature, now appear visionary as solar and wind installations reduce petroleum dependence. Prime Minister Modi's administration is leveraging this crisis to negotiate favorable long-term energy contracts with desperate suppliers while positioning India as the diplomatic bridge between adversarial powers. Three scenarios now dominate strategic planning across global capitals. The optimistic path involves successful Pakistani mediation, producing a limited ceasefire within 2 weeks, allowing partial Hormuz reopening and crude prices stabilizing around $120 per barrel. However, this requires simultaneous Iranian willingness to accept significant nuclear program constraints and Israeli agreement to limit future preemptive strikes. The catastrophic scenario sees conflict expansion as Hezbollah's rocket barrages from Lebanon trigger full Israeli retaliation, potentially drawing Syria and Turkey into wider regional war. Oil prices could exceed $250, triggering global recession and widespread civil unrest across energy-dependent economies. The most probable outcome involves a grinding stalemate lasting 6 to 8 months, with periodic escalations preventing diplomatic resolution but avoiding total regional conflagration. Surprisingly, this protracted conflict might ultimately benefit emerging economies like India and Brazil, as Western powers become increasingly dependent on alternative partnerships and supply chains. The geopolitical realignment accelerated by this crisis will likely persist long after shooting stops, fundamentally reshaping global energy markets and diplomatic relationships. Today's fuel protests in Ireland represent far more than local economic grievances. They signal the beginning of systemic challenges to Western governments as energy scarcity reshapes political expectations and social contracts. The Whitegate demonstrations will likely inspire similar movements across Europe as populations demand government intervention in markets increasingly divorced from democratic control. This crisis exposes the fundamental fragility of globalized supply chains and the speed with which local conflicts can trigger worldwide instability. The next 48 hours will prove crucial as diplomatic talks in Pakistan either gain momentum towards ceasefire or collapse amid escalating military pressure. Watch for Iran's response to Trump's announcement that American naval forces are actively clearing Hormuz shipping lanes, a move that brings direct U.S.-Iranian military confrontation closer than ever. The Orthodox Easter ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine offers a potential model for Middle Eastern de-escalation, but only if all parties can step back from maximalist positions that have defined this conflict's trajectory. That's your briefing for today. Subscribe so tomorrow's analysis lands in your feed the moment it goes live. And drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Will Ireland's fuel protests spread across Europe? And could civil unrest ultimately force the diplomatic breakthrough that traditional diplomacy has failed to achieve?